On a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1963, the air in Black Hawk County, Iowa, still carried the sharp, clean bite of melting snow. It was the kind of day that promised a spring that was not yet here, a day for planning, for taxes, for the quiet business that preceded the roar of tractors. Inside the clapboard office of Croft Real Estate and Land Management, the air smelled of stale cigar smoke and hot coffee. Silas Croft, a man whose confidence was as wide as the county itself, sat behind a vast oak desk, reviewing plat maps with the casual authority of a general studying a battlefield. The bell over the door chimed a feeble, tinny sound, and he glanced up, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. In the doorway stood a girl. Or what looked to him like a girl. She was 22 years old, but her frame was slight, and she was swallowed by the heavy wool barn coat she wore. It was a man's coat, faded to the color of dust, the cuffs frayed and the collar stained with the honest grease of a workshop. Silas knew the coat. It had belonged to old man Hemlock, who had died just 3 weeks prior, leaving behind a quarter section of land and this one solitary granddaughter. Her name was Evelyn. She closed the door softly behind her and approached the desk, her footsteps silent on the worn linoleum. She held a small canvas bank bag in one hand. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear but not loud. "I'm here to pay the property tax bill for the Hemlock farm." Silas Croft leaned back in his creaking leather chair. He took off his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw the grief there, but underneath it, something else. Something quiet and stubborn. He'd seen that look before, in her grandfather's eyes, a man who had farmed that same 160 acres for 50 years with the same 2 tractors and an almost religious aversion to debt. Good farmer, quiet man. A fool, in Silas Croft's professional opinion. "Evelyn," he began, his voice a low, paternal rumble. "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. He was a fixture in this county." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, child." She remained standing. "Thank you, sir. I just need to settle the account." He sighed, a puff of air that ruffled the papers on his desk. This was the part of his job he found tedious. The tidying up after a death. The gentle steering of heirs toward common sense. "Evelyn, your grandfather left you that farm free and clear. That's a fine legacy. A fine nest egg. Land prices are good right now. Very strong. A place like that, even with the old house, you could probably get $400 an acre. Maybe more. That's $64,000. A fortune for a young woman like you." He paused, letting the number hang in the air. He watched her face for a reaction, for the dawning realization of what that money could mean. A new life in Des Moines or Chicago. A husband, a family, away from the mud and the misery of a farm. Evelyn simply opened the bank bag. She drew out a sheaf of bills held together by a rubber band. The bill was for $312.40, she stated. She laid the money on his desk. Silas Croft looked at the cash, then back at her. He couldn't help but let out a short, breathy laugh. It wasn't mean-spirited, not really. It was the laugh of a man who had seen this exact scenario 100 times and knew how it ended. It was the laugh of pure, unadulterated certainty. "Sweetheart," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "What do you think you're going to do? Farm it? By yourself? Do you know what it takes to run a farm these days? It takes capital. It takes credit. It takes a new 4-bottom plow and a diesel tractor, not those old relics your grandfather kept." He leaned forward, his tone shifting from amusement to earnest, fatherly advice. "You sell that place. You sell it to one of your neighbors, somebody who can actually make a go of it. You take that money and you make a life for yourself. This is no place for a little girl." Evelyn looked at him. Her expression did not change. Her gaze was as steady and flat as the Iowa horizon. "I made a promise, Mr. Croft." "A promise?" He scoffed. "Your grandfather wouldn't want you breaking your back for a piece of dirt. He'd want you to be happy. Secure. He made me promise I wouldn't let the bankers have it," she said. "He said the land remembers. He said you take care of it, and it'll take care of you. I aim to do that." Silas stared at her. The sheer, naive simplicity of it was astounding. He picked up the cash, counted it slowly, and pulled a heavy ledger toward him. He dipped a pen in an inkwell, a flourish of old-world business, and made a notation next to the Hemlock property line. Paid in full. March 12, 1963. He wrote out a receipt on a slip of paper and pushed it, along with the 60 cents in change, across the desk. His smile returned, thin and pitying. "Keep the change, little girl," he said. "Buy yourself a bus ticket when you come to your senses." Evelyn picked up the receipt, leaving the coins on the polished oak. She folded the paper once and put it in the pocket of her grandfather's coat. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Croft," she said, and then she turned and walked out of the office, the little bell over the door marking her exit. Silas Croft watched her go. He shook his head slowly, a deep sense of melancholy settling over him. He felt sorry for her. He truly did. He gave her 6 months. A year, tops. The farm would chew her up and spit her out, just like it did to everyone who tried to fight it with sentiment instead of steel. "Let me tell you about the first test." Evelyn got back to the farm in her grandfather's rattling Ford pickup. The silence of the place was a physical weight. For her entire life, that farm had been filled with the sounds of him, the clang of a hammer on steel, the low whistle as he worked, the rumble of the old Farm tractor. Now, there was only the wind whistling through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees. The spring thaw was coming fast. The ground would be ready for plowing in a week, maybe 2. The first and most vital task was to get the Model M running. It had sat in the barn all winter, a hulking red beast of iron and grease. Her grandfather had always said the M was the heart of the farm. Forged in 1948, it was simple, powerful, and, if you knew its secrets, utterly reliable. She climbed onto the iron seat, the cold of it biting through her jeans. She pulled the choke, twisted the key, and stomped on the starter. The engine turned over once, a slow, guttural groan, and then fell silent. She tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. That was the first hurdle. She spent the next 2 hours wrestling the heavy battery out of its housing, loading it into the pickup, and driving the 7 miles into town to the service station. They put it on the charger and told her to come back in the morning. An entire day was lost. The next morning, with the recharged battery installed, she tried again. The engine now turned over briskly, but it wouldn't catch. It just spun, a hollow, lifeless sound. She checked the fuel. The tank was half full. She pulled a spark plug wire, held it near the engine block, and cranked it again. No spark. Ignition problem. It could be the coil, the condenser, the points, the distributor cap. She wasn't a master mechanic like her grandfather, but she had been his shadow in the workshop since she was old enough to hold a wrench. She remembered his hands, thick and calloused, moving with an unhurried grace as he diagnosed an engine's ills. "Listen to it, Evie," he would say. "It's telling you what's wrong." She spent the rest of the day working in the cold barn. She pulled the distributor cap. The contacts were corroded. She painstakingly cleaned them with a small file and a piece of sandpaper. She checked the points, filing them smooth and setting the gap with a feeler gauge from her grandfather's toolbox, the measurement, 20/1000 of an inch, etched into her memory. She put it all back together. She climbed back onto the seat, her hands numb and black with grease. She took a deep breath. She turned the key. The engine coughed once, a puff of white smoke from the exhaust stack. It coughed again, then roared to life with a deafening, beautiful clatter. The whole barn seemed to vibrate with the power of it. Evelyn closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. It was the sound of a heartbeat. It was the sound of a chance. The neighbors watched. They saw the light on in the barn late at night. They saw her, a small figure in a big coat, wrestling with the moldboard plow, fighting to get the hitch pinned. At the co-op in the mornings, over coffee, they talked. "Poor kid," said Dale Miller, whose farm bordered hers to the west. "She's got the heart, but this is no place for sentiment." "Croft says she turned down a good offer," added Ben Jansen. "Prideful. That Hemlock stubbornness." They shook their heads. They predicted failure. They weren't cruel men, they were realists. They knew what the land demanded. She got the corn in the ground 2 weeks later than everyone else. The planting season was a blur of exhaustion. She'd drive the tractor until the sun went down, then eat a can of soup in the cold kitchen, and fall into bed, only to wake up before dawn, her muscles screaming in protest. She did it all. The plowing, the disking, the planting. 160 acres. Alone. That year, 1963, the weather was unkind. A dry spell in July stunted the corn just as it was pollinating. Her yield was a paltry 82 bushels to the acre. The county average was nearly 110. When she sold it at the grain elevator, the check felt impossibly small for the mountain of work it represented. After paying for the fuel and the seed from the prior spring, her net profit for the entire year was $1,240. It was not a victory. It was survival, measured in the slimmest of margins. But it was enough. It was enough to pay the taxes again, to buy seed for the next year, and to prove the skeptics wrong for one more season. Let me tell you about the moment of doubt. It came in the dead of winter, in January of 1964. A blizzard swept down from Canada and buried Black Hawk County under 2 feet of snow. For 3 days, the wind howled, rattling the old farmhouse windows and piling drifts up to the eaves. Evelyn was trapped. The isolation was absolute. The silence, once a comfort, became a crushing weight. She sat at the big oak kitchen table, the same table where her grandmother had served 1,000 meals. In front of her was a simple ledger book. On one side, her meager income. On the other, her projected expenses for the coming year: seed, fuel, fertilizer, taxes. The numbers refused to cooperate. No matter how she figured it, the margin was razor-thin. One bad hailstorm, one broken axle, one sick cow, and it would all be over. The words of Silas Croft echoed in the quiet room. This is no place for a little girl, he had been so sure. All the men at the co-op had been so sure. What if they were right? What if this whole endeavor was just a fool's errand, a child's promise made without understanding the cost? The $64,000 he'd mentioned seemed like an impossible dream, a ticket to a world without aching muscles and the constant, gnawing worry. She got up and walked to the window, rubbing a clear circle in the frost. Outside, the world was a formless swirl of white. She could just make out the dark shape of the barn, its roofline sagging slightly under the weight of the snow. Her grandfather had built that barn with his own 2 hands. He had mortgaged everything to buy this land in the depths of the Depression. He had held on. As she stared, her own reflection ghosted over the image of the barn. She saw a pale, tired face, and for a fleeting second, she didn't recognize herself. She saw only the stubborn set of her jaw. It was her grandfather's jaw. And then she remembered his voice, not his words of advice, but the stories he used to tell. Stories of the Dust Bowl, of the grasshopper plagues, of the 5-cent corn. Stories of survival. The land has a long memory, Evie, he'd said, sitting on the porch swing one summer evening. People forget, but the land doesn't. You treat it like a bank, always taking, never putting nothing back, and one day you'll find it's empty. But you treat it with respect, you feed it, it'll feed you. It'll remember. Her resolve, which had wavered and thinned to a fragile thread, suddenly hardened into steel. She was not just farming a piece of land, she was upholding a covenant. She turned away from the window, the doubt burned out of her like a fever. Fueled by this renewed purpose, she went to her grandfather's old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room. It was a place she had avoided, a shrine of his private world. She opened it gently. It was filled with old receipts, catalogs for seed corn from the 1940s, and newspaper clippings of crop prices. She was looking for something, anything, a piece of his wisdom she might have missed. In a deep bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old almanacs, she found it. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, far heavier than it looked. It wasn't an account book. The pages were filled with her grandfather's neat, spidery script. She opened it to the first page. The date was April 10, 1923. It was a soil journal. For 40 years, her grandfather had kept a meticulous, daily record of the farm. Not of its finances, but of its life. He had recorded rainfall to the 100th of an inch, measured with a can on a fence post. He noted soil temperatures, planting dates, germination rates, pest infestations. He had divided the 160 acres into a grid of 1-acre plots, and for each plot, he recorded the crop rotation, the application of manure from the dairy cows he'd once kept, the pH levels tested with a simple litmus kit, and the final yield. It was a staggering document, a 4-decade conversation between a man and his land. She spent the rest of that night, and the next day, reading. The journal revealed a hidden world beneath the surface of the fields. She learned about the clay seam that ran through the south pasture, the sandy loam near the creek, the spot in the east 80 that was always the last to dry out in the spring. And then she found the entries about the north 40. For years, her grandfather had referred to it as the sour ground. His yields there were always 10, 15 bushels lower than anywhere else. The neighbors told him it was useless, poorly drained and acidic. The new wisdom, preached by the university extension agents in the 1950s, was to dump tons of chemical nitrogen and lime on it, to force it into productivity. But her grandfather had refused. Instead, the journal chronicled a different approach. A patient, 20-year-long experiment. He used a complex, 7-year rotation on that plot. 2 years of alfalfa to fix nitrogen deep in the soil profile. A year of red clover, then plowed under as green manure, then corn, then soybeans, then oats, then back to pasture. He documented how he spread wood ash from the stove to balance the pH, how he hauled muck from the creek bed to build organic matter. He wasn't trying to conquer the soil. He was trying to heal it. The final entry for the North 40 was from the fall of 1962, just before he died. Yield, 115 bushels/acre, he wrote. Soil is dark and sweet. It remembers. Evelyn closed the book. Her hands were trembling. This was the knowledge Silas Croft and the men at the co-op didn't have. They saw land as a commodity, a thing to be exploited with bigger machines and stronger chemicals. Her grandfather had seen it as a living partner. This journal wasn't just a record, it was a roadmap. It was her inheritance, more valuable than any sum of money. It was the hidden weapon in a war she had just realized she could win. Let me tell you about the long years of patient work. The 2 decades from 1964 to 1984 were a slow, quiet montage of labor. Evelyn lived by the rhythms of the sun and the seasons, and by the wisdom in the leather-bound journal. While the world of agriculture was undergoing a revolution, she became a practitioner of an older faith. Her neighbors were mortgaging their futures. They bought gleaming green John Deere 4020s and then 4430s, tractors with air-conditioned cabs and radios. They traded them in every few years for bigger, more powerful models. They bought massive combines that could harvest 100 acres in a day. To pay for this machinery, they had to plant every available inch of land, fence row to fence row, year after year, mostly corn and soybeans. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, had told them to get big or get out, and they had listened. They borrowed heavily from the banks, confident that land values and commodity prices would only ever go up. Evelyn kept the farm. She became an expert in its maintenance, learning its every quirk and complaint. She did her own valve jobs, grinding the valves by hand on the bench grinder. She rebuilt the carburetor so many times she could do it in the dark. She taught herself to weld, laying neat beads of steel to repair cracked plowshares and broken hitches. Her workshop was a museum of ingenuity, filled with tools her grandfather had owned and parts she salvaged from scrapyards. She followed the journal's rotations religiously. She took land out of production, planting it with clover and alfalfa, letting it rest and rebuild. Her neighbors thought she was insane. Dale Miller once stopped his massive International Harvester 1066 at her fence line, watching her cultivate a field of green manure. "You're wasting a crop, Evie," he shouted over the roar of his diesel engine. "You could get 150 bushels of corn off that piece." Evelyn just waved and kept driving her little red tractor. She knew that the nitrogen her clover was putting into the soil for free was worth more than the corn he would have to buy fertilizer for. Her input costs were laughably low. While her neighbors spent tens of thousands of dollars a year on anhydrous ammonia, potash, and phosphate, her biggest fertilizer expense was the diesel fuel it took to haul manure from the small cattle herd she'd started. The social distance grew. She was no longer just the poor Hemlock girl, she was Grandma Evie, an eccentric holdout from a bygone era. They stopped offering advice and just shook their heads as they drove past her fields, which were often a patchwork of different crops, looking messy and inefficient compared to their vast, uniform monocultures. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the land began to respond. During the dry summer of 1976, her fields stayed green a week longer than anyone else's. Her soil, rich with years of organic matter, acted like a sponge, holding onto the precious moisture. While her neighbor's corn withered, hers held on. Her yields that year were not just stable, they were better than the county average. The county extension agent, a young man fresh out of Iowa State University, stopped by one day, perplexed. He had her soil test results in his hand. "Miss Hemlock," he said, scratching his head. "I've never seen numbers like this. Your organic matter is over 7%. The average around here is under 3. Your soil structure, it's perfect. What are you doing?" "I'm just doing what my grandfather taught me," she said simply. Silas Croft saw her in town from time to time. By the mid-1970s, his bemusement had curdled into a kind of grudging confusion. He was the biggest land broker in the county, the architect of the Great Expansion, facilitating the loans and sales that allowed farmers to get big. He saw Evelyn at the bank, making deposits, never withdrawals. He heard the talk. He knew she was surviving, even quietly prospering, but he couldn't understand how. It defied every law of modern agriculture. "Still playing farmer, little girl?" he asked her one day in the post office in 1978. His voice lacked its old confidence. "Still am, Mr. Croft," she replied, and went back to mailing a letter. She lived simply. She never remodeled the old farmhouse. She drove the same Ford pickup until the floorboards rusted through. Every dollar of profit went into one of 3 places: a savings account at the local bank, the upkeep of her equipment, or the land itself. She never borrowed a penny. She owed nothing to anyone but the memory of her grandfather and the wisdom in his journal. Let me tell you about the storm. It arrived in 1981. It was not a storm of wind or rain, but of money. To combat runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, raised interest rates to unprecedented levels. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, soared to over 20%. For farmers, who lived and died by their annual operating loans, it was a death sentence. The loans they had taken out at 7 or 8% were suddenly renegotiated at 18, 20, even 22%. At the same time, a U.S. grain embargo against the Soviet Union caused the bottom to fall out of the commodity markets. The price of corn, which had been over $3 a bushel, collapsed to under 2. Suddenly, farmers were paying triple the interest to finance a crop that was worth a third less. It was a perfect storm of economic devastation. The foundation of their prosperity, the value of their land, crumbled beneath them. Land that Silas Croft had been selling for $2,000 an acre in 1980 was worth less than $800 by 1983. The farmers' equity, the collateral for their massive loans, vanished overnight. The bankers, who had been so eager to lend money just a few years before, called in their notes. The foreclosure notices started appearing like mushrooms after a rain, tacked to the fence posts of farms that had been in the same families for 100 years. The weekly farm auction became the defining social event of the era, a grim spectacle of financial ruin where men watched their lives' work sold off to the highest bidder. Dale Miller, the man who had yelled at Evelyn about her clover field, lost everything. His 2 huge tractors, his 6-row combine, and his 800 acres were sold on the courthouse steps. Ben Jansen, who had called her stubborn, went bankrupt a year later. The wave of destruction washed over Black Hawk County, taking the big, leveraged operators first, the very men who had embodied the "get big or get out" philosophy. Evelyn was an island in the storm. She had no debt. The interest rate could have been 1,000%, it wouldn't have mattered to her. The low commodity prices hurt, but because her input costs were so low, she was still making a small profit while her neighbors were losing hundreds of dollars on every acre they planted. She started going to the auctions. She stood at the back of the crowds, a quiet figure in her old coat, and watched. She didn't go to gloat. She went because it was her duty. When Dale Miller's farm came up for sale, the bank was the only bidder. The auctioneer was about to gavel it sold when Evelyn raised her hand. "I bid $800 an acre," she said, her voice carrying in the stunned silence. She bought the entire 320-acre farm. She paid for it with a cashier's check from the account she had been feeding for 20 years. Cash. Over the next 3 years, she did the same thing 5 more times. She bought the Jansen place. She bought the old Smith farm. She never took advantage, always paying the fair, albeit depressed, market price. She expanded her holdings from her original 160 acres to over 2,000. She bought her neighbor's state-of-the-art equipment for pennies on the dollar, hauling it back to her workshop to repair it herself. She was not just surviving the crisis, she was thriving because of it. Her careful, patient, debt-averse strategy had been perfectly designed to withstand the very storm that had destroyed everyone who had followed the conventional wisdom. Let me tell you about the apology. It was a Saturday afternoon in the fall of 1986. The farm crisis had burned itself out, leaving a landscape of scarred lives and consolidated land holdings. Evelyn was in her workshop, grinding the rust off a plowshare, the air thick with the smell of hot metal. A dusty, late-model sedan she didn't recognize pulled into her long gravel driveway. An old man got out. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped. It took her a moment to realize it was Silas Croft. His once booming confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a frail, defeated figure. His fine suit was replaced by a simple windbreaker. His real estate business, built entirely on the leveraged land boom, had been one of the crisis's corporate casualties. He walked over to the open barn door and stood there, watching her work. She shut off the grinder, the sudden silence ringing in her ears. She lifted her safety goggles and waited. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had ever used her given name without a patronizing sweetheart or child attached to it. His voice was raspy. "I was just driving by." "I see you've expanded." "A little," she said. He looked around at the vast, well-maintained farmstead, at the rows of equipment parked neatly for the winter. He looked at her, a woman in her mid-40s, her hands stained with grease, her face lined by sun and worry, but her eyes clear and calm. "I came here to tell you something," he said, his gaze falling to the dusty floor. "I came to tell you that I was wrong. All those years ago, in my office. I was a fool. I laughed at you," his voice cracked. "I thought I knew everything about land and money and farming. I told everyone to borrow, to expand. I built my whole life on that idea." He looked up, and she could see the profound shame in his eyes. "I lost everything, Evelyn. My business. My own family century farm. The bank took it last year. I got the same advice I gave everyone else, and it was poison." He took a shaky breath. "You were the one who was right. You and that stubborn old man, your grandfather. You were the only ones who saw this coming. You were the smart 1 inch. Evelyn wiped her hands on a rag. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in seeing this man humbled. There was only a deep, weary sadness for him, and for all the others. For the whole broken system. "I wasn't smart, Mr. Croft," she said softly. "I was just careful. My grandfather taught me to be careful." She paused, then added, "He also taught me to read." She led him out of the workshop and into the quiet farmhouse. From the bottom of a heavy cedar chest, she retrieved a tin box. She opened it and took out a stack of old, brittle documents. One was the original 1902 deed to the Miller farm, the first one she had bought at auction. But she laid another document next to it. It was a right-of-first refusal, signed in 1902 by her great-grandfather and his neighbor, the original Mr. Miller. It had been properly filed with the county and then forgotten by everyone for 80 years. It gave the Hemlock family the first legal right to purchase the Miller farm at a fixed price of $100 an acre if it was ever to be sold outside the Miller family. "My grandfather mentioned it in his journal," she explained. "A note in the margin in 1935. It took me a month in the county archives to find the original filing. When the bank foreclosed on Dale Miller, they had to honor it. It was the law." Silas Croft stared at the document. It was not luck. It was not a miracle. It was knowledge. Deep, patient, hidden knowledge. The final, crushing proof that his world of fast money and easy credit was a house of cards compared to the solid foundation of inherited wisdom. He had built an empire on paper, she had built one on the earth itself. Let me tell you about the legacy. Years passed. The 1980s became a scar, then a memory. Evelyn Hemlock became a legend. She continued to farm her 2,000 acres, debt-free and prosperous. She never married, never had children of her own. The farm was her family. She lived in the same small house, drove a modest truck, and every spring, she would start the old Farmel M and take one ceremonial lap around the barn, a tribute to the machine and the men who had taught her its ways. The tractor sat in the main bay of the barn, restored to a perfect, gleaming red, a monument to a different way of thinking. The soiled journal sat on the mantelpiece, its leather cover worn smooth by her hands. In 2008, when she was in her late 60s, a young couple came to see her. They had agricultural degrees from Iowa State and a mountain of student loan debt. They dreamed of farming, but the price of land and equipment made it impossible. They had come to her, the story went, to ask if she would sell them a small parcel. She listened to them talk, heard the passion and the desperation in their voices. She saw in them the same fire she'd had at 22. She did not sell them any land. Instead, she leased them her original 160 acres, the home farm, for $1 a year. The contract was for 5 years. She didn't give them money or equipment. She took them into the house, lifted the old journal from the mantel, and placed it in the young woman's hands. "The answers are in here," Evelyn told them. "Forget what they taught you at the university. Listen to this. Be patient. Live simply. Own nothing. The land remembers." The man in the big office, the expert, the voice of the modern world, had told her to go home. He said a little girl couldn't do the work. He laughed, and the whole world laughed with him. But Evelyn Hemlock put on her grandfather's coat, put her hands on his tools, and she kept the farm. She listened to the quiet wisdom of the soil, to the long memory of the land. And when the bankers and the experts and the gamblers were all washed away, she was the one left standing. She was the one who remained.